In Burkina Faso, electricity is not something people take for granted. It is something people plan around. Shops close early because the lights might go out. Phones are charged whenever power appears, not when it's convenient. Fans stop in the middle of the night. Hospitals keep generators ready like backup organs. Darkness is not an emergency, it is normal. This is the everyday reality for most of the country, where reliable electricity has always been limited, unstable, and often imported from outside borders. Life functions on improvisation instead of certainty. Now place one new fact inside that reality. Burkina Faso has just added 200 megawatts of electricity to its grid in 6 months. Not announced with speeches, not celebrated with ceremonies, just quietly completed. In a country built around power shortages, something that big should be impossible. So the real question isn't what was built, it's how something this large appeared without anyone making a noise about it. Let's find out. The first thing to understand is that Burkina Faso has never truly lived inside its own electrical system. For years, large parts of the country's grid have depended on power coming from outside its borders, mainly from coastal West African states. Electricity didn't originate inside the country. It traveled through long transmission lines that could fail, get damaged, or become politically vulnerable at any moment. When neighboring systems struggled, Burkina Faso didn't have alternatives. The lights simply went out. This created a strange national rhythm where instability became normal. Entire cities learned to expect outages. Businesses invested more in fuel than in equipment. Internet providers built networks knowing they would collapse every evening. Hospitals didn't assume electricity would exist. They planned around its absence. In practice, this meant the economy could never fully grow. You can't scale manufacturing if machines stop randomly. You can't run digital services if servers lose power. You can't build logistics systems if refrigeration fails. Even basic governance becomes harder when government offices themselves rely on generators. Electricity wasn't infrastructure. It was an external dependency that shaped behavior at every level of society. And because power was imported, it was expensive. Every kilowatt had a cost beyond money. Vulnerability. Burkina Faso didn't control pricing. It didn't control supply. It didn't control reliability. It was plugged into someone else's system and forced to accept whatever came through the cable. This created an invisible ceiling on ambition. People could imagine development, but systems couldn't sustain it. Policies existed on paper, but physical reality kept undermining them. Even when there was political will, the material conditions simply weren't there. What's important here is not just the technical problem, it's the psychological one. After decades of unreliable electricity, society internalized limitations. Entrepreneurs learned to think small. Public institutions learned to expect failure. Citizens learned not to demand continuity because continuity had never existed. Scarcity stopped feeling temporary and started feeling permanent. So when a country built on borrowed power suddenly installs 200 megawatts of domestic electricity, it's not just an upgrade. It's a disruption of how the entire system has learned to behave. It challenges the assumption that instability is inevitable. It questions the idea that power shortages are natural. It interrupts a long history where nothing could ever be planned with certainty. And that's why this project feels unsettling even before you look at the numbers. Because it doesn't just change capacity, it changes expectations. For the first time, Burkina Faso is not waiting for electricity to arrive from somewhere else. It is generating it inside its own territory, on its own grid, under its own control. Which brings us to the real mystery. If this dependency was so deep, so structural, and so long-standing, what kind of actor was able to bypass all of that and build something this heavy without getting trapped in the same old system? The answer is simple, and that's what makes it uncomfortable. This project did not come from the development world at all. It came from the business world. A Dubai-based industrial group entered Burkina Faso not as a donor, not as a partner in reform, not as a friend of development, but as a company looking at a market that was obviously broken. A country with massive electricity shortages is not a tragedy to an investor. It is a demand waiting to be served. That single difference explains almost everything. Instead of asking how to improve governance, they asked how fast a power plant could be built. Instead of negotiating policy conditions, they calculated load capacity. Instead of planning workshops and consultations, they planned turbines, fuel supply, and grid connection. The 180 million euros was not aid. It was capital deployed with the expectation of return. Electricity would be sold. Revenue would come from actual usage. The plant was not designed to help Burkina Faso. It was designed to function inside Burkina Faso's existing hunger for power. And that's exactly why it moved so fast. 6 months is only possible when nothing is symbolic. No stakeholder theater, no donor evaluations, no international performance, just engineering, procurement, construction, and deadlines. The project didn't need to be morally impressive, it needed to work. This is why there was no public celebration. Investors don't need ceremonies, they need kilowatts flowing into the grid. Silence wasn't negligence, it was efficiency. What makes this significant is not foreign involvement. Africa has always had foreign actors. What makes it different is the absence of ideological framing. There was no narrative about saving Burkina Faso, no story about development, no emotional packaging. This was treated as infrastructure, not destiny. And that quietly breaks a long pattern. For decades, major African projects have been filtered through global institutions that decide what is acceptable, sustainable, ethical, or aligned with reform agendas. Projects get reshaped to fit external expectations instead of internal needs. This one skipped that entire layer. The plant was not built to impress Washington, Brussels, or Geneva. It was built to plug into an electricity-starved grid and start generating money. That's why there were no conferences. There was nothing to debate. The market had already decided, which creates a strange inversion. For once, Burkina Faso did not need to convince the world that it deserved infrastructure. Infrastructure arrived because demand made it profitable. And once development stops being permission-based and becomes market-based, the entire power relationship shifts. The state is no longer asking for approval. It is offering an opportunity. That is a very different position to occupy. But this leads to a deeper question that goes beyond finance. If this plant exists purely because demand made it inevitable, what kind of economic transformation becomes possible when electricity is no longer the bottleneck holding everything else back? It unlocks something Burkina Faso has never had at scale before. Continuity, not comfort, not luxury. Continuity. Before this plant, almost every system in the country was designed around interruption. Mining companies built operations knowing machines would stop. Farmers harvested crops knowing storage would fail. Internet services expanded coverage, knowing networks would collapse nightly. Hospitals invested in fuel before investing in equipment. Nothing was built with the assumption that power would stay. 200 megawatts changes that logic completely. This is the level of electricity where systems stop improvising and start stabilizing, where factories can run in full shifts instead of bursts, where cold storage doesn't shut down, where water treatment plants operate continuously instead of in windows, where servers can stay online without generators humming in the background. This is not about lighting homes, it's about making complex systems possible. Think about what that means in practice. Minerals can be processed locally instead of exported raw. Agriculture can shift from survival markets to supply chains. Medical equipment can be used without rationing electricity like medicine. Even simple things like traffic systems, telecom infrastructure, and financial networks become reliable instead of fragile. Electricity stops being a background problem and becomes an invisible foundation. And when electricity becomes invisible, productivity becomes visible. This is the point where economies stop behaving like emergency zones and start behaving like structures, where time becomes predictable, where planning makes sense, where long-term investment becomes rational instead of risky. Before this, every ambitious project carried an unspoken question: will the power hold? Now that question slowly disappears. What's important is that this doesn't create growth by itself. It removes the reason growth couldn't exist in the first place. It clears the blockage that forced everything else to operate below capacity. For decades, development strategies in Burkina Faso focused on people, training, education, entrepreneurship, and innovation. But those efforts were happening inside a system with no mechanical backbone. You can't scale human potential if physical systems keep collapsing underneath it. This plant doesn't create talent. It creates an environment where talent stops wasting energy surviving. And that is a deeper transformation than any policy document could ever achieve. Because once electricity becomes stable, society stops negotiating with chaos. It starts negotiating with itself. How to use time, how to organize labor, how to distribute resources, how to build institutions that actually last. This is the moment where development stops being emotional and becomes logistical. But something is striking about how this was done. This wasn't designed to look modern. It wasn't built to win climate awards. It wasn't shaped for global approval. It was built to work, even if it looked ugly doing it. Which raises the next uncomfortable question. If this project was about pure functionality, not image, why did Burkina Faso choose the most unfashionable energy source instead of the clean, symbolic solutions everyone promotes? Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. Because symbolism doesn't keep machines running. For years, most modern energy projects in Africa have been designed to look good in reports. Solar villages, pilot wind farms, demonstration grids, all of them photogenic, all of them limited. They work on paper, in presentations, and in daylight. But heavy systems don't care about aesthetics. They care about stability. Thermal power delivers something renewables cannot guarantee on their own. Baseload. Constant voltage, continuous output, predictable supply. It runs at night, during storms, during droughts, during political crises. It does not negotiate with the weather. Factories need machines that don't stop mid-process. Data centers need servers that don't reboot every few hours. Water treatment systems need uninterrupted flow. Hospitals need equipment that doesn't depend on sunlight. Industrial economies require energy that behaves like a utility, not like a mood. That's why every industrial nation in history, without exception, first built thermal capacity before transitioning to cleaner systems. Coal, gas, oil, nuclear. Only after achieving stability did they diversify into renewables. Burkina Faso simply followed the same mechanical logic without pretending it could skip stages. This choice wasn't ideological. It was unavoidable. If you want continuous systems, you need continuous power. And continuous power currently means thermal. What's striking is how unfashionable this decision is. It doesn't fit donor narratives. It doesn't look progressive on social media. It doesn't trigger applause at climate conferences. It looks old, industrial, and politically incorrect. But it works. And working changes everything. Because once electricity becomes stable, it stops being a topic of conversation. It becomes invisible infrastructure. People no longer ask whether the lights will go out. They start asking what they can build. This is where the story shifts from economics to power in the political sense. Stable energy gives the state something it has never fully possessed before: operational independence. It means systems can function regardless of external conditions. It means communications, security, data, and emergency response no longer depend on someone else's grid. Electricity stops being a service. It becomes a strategic asset. That is the real consequence of choosing thermal. Not pollution, not image, not ideology, control. Control over time, over systems, over continuity. Which leads to the next layer of the story. Once a country controls its own electricity at scale, what kind of geopolitical position does it suddenly occupy in a world where dependence has become a liability? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. It occupies a position of insulation. Not power in the sense of dominance, but power in the sense of resilience. The ability to keep functioning even when external systems become unstable. Because electricity is the first layer on which every modern structure rests. Without it, nothing else operates. Not borders, not databases, not financial networks, not military systems, not emergency services. When electricity is imported, every one of those systems is exposed. A diplomatic dispute can become a blackout. A regional conflict can become a national shutdown. A sanctions package can quietly disable infrastructure without a single shot being fired. That's why energy dependence is not just economic. It is a strategic vulnerability. For years, Burkina Faso existed inside that vulnerability. Its communications relied on external grids. Its digital systems ran on borrowed power. Its security infrastructure functioned only as long as someone else's cables kept working. Domestic power changes that relationship completely. It doesn't make the country untouchable, but it removes the easiest pressure point. It means systems remain online even if neighbors collapse. Markets fluctuate or alliances shift, and this matters more now than ever. The global system is no longer stable. Supply chains are fragmenting. Sanctions are normalized. Trade routes are politicized. Infrastructure itself has become a battlefield. In that environment, controlling your own electricity is not development. It's insurance. Insurance against external leverage. Insurance against political isolation. Insurance against economic blackmail. No one can threaten what they cannot switch off. This is why energy infrastructure is always one of the first targets in modern conflicts. Not because it's symbolic, but because it's foundational. You don't need to occupy a country if you can disable its systems. So when Burkina Faso quietly adds 200 megawatts of domestic power, it is doing something more subtle than building capacity. It is reducing the number of ways the outside world can interfere with its internal functioning. That is a geopolitical move, even if it looks like engineering. And it explains the silence again. You don't announce insulation, you install it, you don't celebrate independence, you build it quietly and let the consequences unfold over time. The state now has something it never had before: the ability to keep operating without asking permission. Which leads to the final question of the story. If electricity is no longer a limiting factor, if the system can finally run continuously, what kind of transformation becomes possible for a society that has spent decades organizing itself around interruption? It becomes a society that can finally plan. Not in the abstract sense of 5-year strategies or political roadmaps, but in the practical sense of everyday life. When electricity is stable, time itself changes. People stop organizing their days around uncertainty. Businesses stop assuming collapse. Institutions stop operating in emergency mode. For the first time, continuity becomes normal instead of exceptional. This is a deeper transformation than economic growth. Growth can happen in bursts. Planning requires stability. You can survive without power. You cannot structure without it. Once electricity becomes reliable, the economy stops reacting and starts anticipating. Factories can invest in long-term machinery. Farmers can commit to large-scale production. Hospitals can expand services instead of rationing them. Digital systems can store data instead of resetting it. Even social behavior shifts. When people are no longer negotiating with blackouts, they start negotiating with opportunity. Education feels useful. Skills feel transferable. Futures feel real instead of theoretical. This is how physical infrastructure reshapes psychology. Before this, ambition in Burkina Faso existed in imagination but struggled in reality. Young people learned, dreamed, planned, and then hit invisible walls. Systems failed not because of incompetence, but because the foundation itself was unstable. Now the foundation changes. This doesn't mean prosperity arrives automatically. It means the conditions for prosperity finally exist. It removes the mechanical excuse that everything else hid behind. No more blaming darkness for stagnation. No more postponing projects because power might fail. No more designing small because systems can't hold large. The ceiling lifts. And when ceilings lift, societies start asking different questions. Not, can we survive? But, what do we build? Not what is possible, but what is worth doing. This is where the story stops being about electricity and starts being about identity. A generation that grows up with continuity will not behave as one raised in interruption. Their expectations will be higher. Their tolerance for dysfunction will be lower. Their relationship with the state will be different. They won't accept excuses built on scarcity because they won't have lived inside scarcity. That is the quiet consequence of this project. Not the megawatts, not the money, not the investors. The emergence of a society that no longer organizes itself around failure. And once that happens, the original power plant becomes almost irrelevant, because its real product wasn't electricity. It was a new baseline for what normal looks like. So the final question isn't whether this plant was important. The final question is what kind of country emerges when a generation no longer knows what it feels like to wait for the lights to come back on. Let us know in the comments section, how do you think it will change Burkina Faso? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.